The cabin lights flickered once, a soft hum of the engines filling the silence. Somewhere in first class, a champagne flute clinked lightly against a tray, the sound delicate, refined, like everything else in this floating world of exclusivity. But something was wrong. Maria Davis noticed it the second she stepped onto the plane. It wasn't the usual airline fatigue, nor was it the subtle tension that often came with business travel. No, this was different. The air felt weighted, charged, like a storm forming just beyond the horizon. She wasn't new to this. As a corporate lawyer specializing in civil rights, Maria had spent years walking into rooms where she wasn't expected to take up space. She recognized the glances, the small pauses in conversation when she entered, the calculated indifference. Microaggressions weren't a concept to her. They were a lived experience. Still, she didn't expect it here. Not in first class, not on a flight she had paid for in full. The first sign came early. As she settled into her window seat, she noticed the flight attendant, a tall, blonde woman with a name tag that read, Margaret Wilson, handing out menus, one to the businessman across from her, one to the couple whispering over a shared bottle of wine, another to the woman with the oversized sunglasses, lazily scrolling through a tablet. Maria waited, but the menu never came. She cleared her throat, tilting her head slightly in Margaret's direction. The flight attendant was only a few feet away, still distributing menus with the same perfectly rehearsed smile. A small test. "Excuse me," Maria said, her voice even. "Could I get a menu?" Margaret barely glanced at her. "Oh, we're running low," she replied smoothly, the same way someone might comment on an unexpected rain shower. "Let me check if we have extras." Maria held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't the words that caught her attention. It was the way they were said. A little too quick, a little too polished, as if they had been used before. Then, before she could say anything else, the flight attendant walked away. Fine, Maria thought, shifting in her seat. It wasn't the first time she'd been overlooked. It wouldn't be the last. But something inside her told her to pay attention. That feeling grew when the drink service began. She watched Margaret move down the aisle, offering wine and cocktails with effortless charm. Yet when she reached Maria's row, she simply skipped over her. No eye contact, no offer, just a perfectly executed act of erasure. Maria felt the irritation stir, but she didn't react. Not yet. Instead, she turned her attention to the man seated diagonally from her. A middle-aged businessman with sharp eyes and an expensive-looking watch. He had been watching the interaction, his mouth opened, like he wanted to say something, but then he didn't. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably and turned back to his laptop. And just like that, Maria understood. This wasn't just oversight. This was intentional. The thought settled into her bones like ice. Then something else happened. 2 rows ahead, the businessman who had been watching her earlier stood up. He was an older man, mid-60s maybe, with silver-streaked hair and the quiet presence of someone who had seen a lot. He stretched briefly, adjusted his tie, then walked toward the restroom. Nothing unusual, but he never came back. At first, Maria didn't think much of it. People took their time in airplane bathrooms. But after 10 minutes, then 15, then 20, she started to notice. The crew didn't seem to care. No hushed whispers, no signs of concern. It was like he had never existed. She glanced at the other passengers. No one else seemed to notice, or if they did, they weren't saying anything. Something was off. Maria reached down, pretending to adjust her bag, but really she was checking the floor. The man's carry-on was still under his seat, his jacket neatly folded still on the armrest. But the man? Gone. Her skin prickled. She sat back, scanning the cabin again. The flight attendants were moving normally, passing trays, pouring drinks. But when she looked closer, she saw it, the tightness in their movements, the way they avoided looking toward that empty seat. They knew. She glanced down at her phone, fingers hovering over the screen. Should she message someone? Report it? But report what exactly? That a man got up and didn't come back? That a flight attendant was skipping over her? That something felt wrong? She exhaled slowly. Not yet. Instead, she reached for her notepad, the small one she always carried for quick legal notes, and jotted down a single line. Passenger 2B, left for restroom, did not return. Just as she set the pen down, something unexpected happened. As the cart rolled past, a napkin fluttered off one of the trays, landing near her foot. Maria reached down, intending to hand it back, until she saw it. A small handwritten message barely visible on the thin paper. Don't stay quiet. They control everything. Her pulse kicked. She looked up, scanning the cabin, but no one was paying attention. She turned the napkin over. Nothing. No signature, no indication of who wrote it. Just that one ominous sentence. Maria's fingers tightened around the paper. She didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear. She wasn't imagining this. Maria folded the napkin carefully, tucking it under her phone as she glanced around the cabin. The businessman's seat was still empty. The flight attendants continued their routine, but she could see it now, the stiffness in their posture, the way their eyes darted toward his row before quickly looking away. She didn't believe in coincidences. Something about this was wrong. She reached for the in-flight entertainment screen, pretending to scroll through movies, but really using it as a cover to observe the crew. Margaret, the blonde flight attendant, had disappeared into the galley. Another attendant, a younger woman with dark hair pulled into a bun, hesitated near Maria's row before walking on. Maria debated her next move. She could call for assistance, but what would she say? A man was missing? Maybe he had just moved seats. Maybe he wasn't missing at all, just elsewhere. But that napkin, someone wanted her to know this wasn't normal. She pulled out her phone, opening a secure messaging app. Her fingers hovered over the screen. Who do you even text about this? Her assistant? No. The police? What jurisdiction would they even have at 30,000 feet? Instead, she typed a message to her colleague, James Porter. Something weird happening on my flight. A passenger disappeared after going to the restroom. Crew's acting like nothing happened. Ever heard of anything like this? She hit send and waited. No response. Not unusual considering he was probably still in a meeting. A few rows ahead, Margaret reappeared, her polished smile back in place. She walked down the aisle, speaking in hushed tones to a male attendant, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the drink cart. When she reached Maria's row, her eyes met hers. Just for a second. Then she moved past. Maria shifted in her seat. The businessman's bag was still untouched, his jacket still neatly draped over the armrest. If he had moved seats, wouldn't he have taken his things? Another 10 minutes passed, then 20. That's when the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently cruising at 35,000 feet. We'll be dimming the cabin lights soon for those who wish to rest. Maria barely registered the words. Her focus was on the male flight attendant, now standing near the cockpit door. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, watching. She clenched her jaw. She was being observed. Reaching down, she unzipped her carry-on just enough to slide her hand inside, wrapping her fingers around her legal pad. If something was happening here, she needed a record. Dates, times, details, facts. She flipped to a fresh page. Time, 9:23 p.m., flight time. Seat 2. B. Passenger left. Did not return crew unresponsive message on napkin unknown sender. The hum of the engines felt louder now, the walls of the cabin closing in. She wasn't imagining this. A sudden shuffle of movement caught her attention. The younger flight attendant, the one who had seemed unsure earlier, was making her way down the aisle. As she neared, she slowed slightly, her hand gripping the edge of the drink cart. Maria tensed. The woman didn't stop, didn't speak. But as she passed, she subtly slid something onto Maria's tray table, a folded piece of paper. Maria waited a few seconds before opening it. Don't ask questions. It's not safe. Her heart pounded. She looked up, but the flight attendant was already gone, moving quickly toward the back of the cabin. Maria swallowed hard. This wasn't just an oversight. This wasn't about a missing menu or ignored service. Something was happening on this flight, and now she was in the middle of it. Maria sat motionless, staring at the paper in her hands. The message was clear: stop asking questions. But that wasn't an option. She had spent years exposing corporate corruption, untangling webs of deceit hidden behind polished press releases and carefully crafted policies. This was no different. She refolded the note, slipping it inside her legal pad. Her fingers tapped against the tray table as she considered her next move. The businessman's seat was still empty, his absence an undeniable hole in the carefully controlled environment of first class. Nobody had asked about him, nobody even seemed to notice. That alone told her everything she needed to know. A flight attendant shouldn't warn a passenger to stay silent unless there was something or someone to fear. She glanced toward the galley. Margaret was there, speaking in hushed tones to another crew member, her expression tense, her Every so often, she flicked her gaze toward Maria's row, her smile long gone. Maria exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to confront her. Direct confrontation wouldn't work, not yet. Instead, she reached for her phone, checking for a response from James. Still nothing. She tried again, this time keeping it vague. "Something's off. Call me when you can." She set her phone face down, her mind racing. If someone on this plane had disappeared, there had to be evidence. A manifest security footage, a name on a boarding pass. They couldn't just erase a person mid-flight, unless they had done it before. A flicker of movement caught her eye. The younger flight attendant, the one who had slipped her the warning, was passing by again. Her face was pale, her hands shaking slightly as she cleared trays. Maria waited until she was close, then spoke just loud enough for her to hear. "Who was he?" The woman froze, gripping the cart so hard her knuckles turned white. "I don't know what you mean," she murmured. Maria studied her. She was young, mid-20s maybe, and clearly rattled, but she wasn't lying. "Then why warn me?" The attendant swallowed hard. "I shouldn't have." "Did something happen to him?" The woman flinched. "Please, just don't involve yourself. It's not safe." Maria's pulse quickened. That was the second time someone had said that. The flight attendant glanced toward the galley, then leaned in just slightly. "You didn't see anything," she whispered. "And if you're smart, you'll forget he was ever here." Then she was gone, disappearing behind the curtain. Maria's grip tightened around her armrest. That confirmed it. The question now was, what was she up against? Maria kept her expression neutral, but inside, her mind was racing. The flight attendant's warning wasn't just fear. It was knowledge. She knew something. But if she was too scared to talk, that meant whatever was happening on this plane was bigger than just one missing passenger. She took a slow breath, glancing around the cabin. The atmosphere felt heavier now, as if the air itself carried the weight of secrecy. The businessman's seat remained empty, his belongings untouched. No flight attendant had moved them. That was unusual. Airlines were meticulous about keeping first class pristine. If a passenger had simply switched seats or been moved elsewhere, his things wouldn't still be here. So where was he? She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. Moving casually as if stretching her legs, she walked toward the restroom. A few heads turned, but most passengers remained absorbed in their screens, their drinks, their conversations. No one else seemed to be paying attention. She stopped near the galley, pretending to adjust her watch. The curtain was slightly open, giving her a glimpse inside. Margaret was there, speaking to a male crew member. Their voices were low, urgent. "She's noticing too much," Margaret muttered. "She's a lawyer," the man replied. "She's trained to." Maria forced herself to keep breathing steadily. They were talking about her. Margaret sighed. "We should have handled this earlier." "She's got no proof," the man said. "And by the time we land, she won't have time to get any." A chill ran down Maria's spine. She stepped away before they could see her, heading back to her seat. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, but her face remained calm. She had spent years in high-pressure negotiations, reading between the lines of contracts designed to obscure the truth. This was no different. They wanted her to drop it. That wasn't going to happen. She reached for her phone. Still no response from James. She switched to another secure app and drafted a message. "Something's happening on my flight. One passenger gone, crew acting strange. Need someone to check passenger logs for seat 2B. Before she could send it, a shadow fell over her. She looked up. Margaret stood there, her usual smile back in place, but her eyes were cold. "Miss Davis," she said, voice smooth as silk. "Is everything all right?" Maria met her gaze. "I was about to ask you the same thing." Margaret's smile didn't falter. "I noticed you walking around. If there's anything you need, I'd be happy to assist." Maria held up her phone. "Actually, I was wondering if there's Wi-Fi trouble. My messages aren't going through." For the first time, Margaret hesitated. Then, just as quickly, she laughed lightly. "Oh, that happens sometimes mid-flight. Should be fine soon." Maria nodded slowly. She was lying. Maria had flown on enough long-haul flights to know that the Wi-Fi didn't just go out. If her messages weren't sending, it was because someone had restricted them. Margaret gave her another empty smile before stepping away. Maria glanced at her phone. The message she had typed remained unsent. She didn't know how, but they were blocking her, which meant they weren't just trying to intimidate her. They were controlling the entire plane. Maria set her phone down, keeping her movements casual, but inside, her mind was calculating. If they had the ability to block communications, this wasn't just about a missing passenger. This was something bigger, more coordinated. She needed to gather information. The businessman's seat was still empty. That was her best lead. She glanced toward the galley. Margaret was gone, likely discussing her next move with the other crew members. Now was her chance. Maria unbuckled her seatbelt, stood up, and walked toward the vacant seat. Her posture relaxed like she was just stretching her legs. No one seemed to pay attention. First-class passengers were used to privacy, not to prying eyes. She slid into the businessman's seat, scanning the area. His carry-on was still beneath the seat in front of him, his jacket still draped over the armrest. But there was something else. His tablet, partially tucked between the seat and the wall. Maria pulled it out and tapped the screen. Locked. She exhaled through her nose. Of course. But then she noticed something, a small red notification in the corner, a missed message. Her pulse quickened. If she could just... "Excuse me, Miss Davis." Maria looked up. A male flight attendant, tall and broad-shouldered, stood beside her. His name tag read Daniel West. Unlike Margaret, his expression wasn't fake friendly. It was blank, controlled. "That's not your seat," he said. Maria met his gaze evenly. "The passenger in this seat hasn't returned in over an hour. I was curious." Daniel's face remained unreadable. "I'm sure he'll be back soon." She gestured to the untouched belongings. "Doesn't look like it." A flicker of something crossed his face, annoyance, frustration. Then just as quickly it was gone. "You should return to your seat," he said, voice even but firm. Maria didn't move. What happened to him? Daniel exhaled, as if this conversation bored him. Perhaps he wasn't feeling well. Maybe he changed seats. It's not unusual. Maria tilted her head. Then why hasn't anyone moved his things? Silence. Then, finally, Daniel's expression shifted. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "If there was an issue," he said, "we'd inform the passengers. But there isn't one." A statement, not an assurance. Maria held his gaze a second longer, then without a word, stood up and returned to her seat. She could feel Daniel watching her the entire way. She sat down, her mind moving fast. She needed to access that tablet. If there was any information on it, it could tell her who the missing passenger was, or why he was gone. But now she knew one thing for sure. Whatever had happened to him, the crew was in on it. Maria kept her expression neutral as she leaned back in her seat, but inside her pulse was racing. Daniel's reaction had confirmed it. This wasn't just an oversight. The crew was covering something up. She needed to act, but she had to be careful. Any wrong move, and they might escalate. Her eyes flicked toward the businessman's seat. The tablet was still there, just out of reach. If she could get it, maybe there was something useful inside, an email, a message, a clue. But Daniel was still watching her. She needed a distraction. Maria pressed the flight attendant call button. A moment later, the young flight attendant, the one who had warned her before, appeared. Her name tag read Emily Brooks. She looked hesitant, like she already knew why she was being called. Maria kept her voice low. "Emily, tell me the truth. What happened to the man in 2B? Emily's eyes darted toward the galley, then back to Maria. "Please stop asking questions." Maria's voice remained steady. "I can't do that." Emily swallowed hard. "You don't understand. They're watching everything. You think this is about him, but it's not. It's bigger." "Bigger?" The word sent a chill through Maria. "Then help me understand," Maria pressed. Emily hesitated, then quickly reached into her apron pocket and slipped a folded napkin onto Maria's tray table. "I have to go," she whispered. "Don't let them see you reading this." She turned and walked away before Maria could respond. Maria waited a beat, then casually unfolded the napkin under the tray table. Not the first, not the last. Her breath caught. Not the first? Her mind flashed back to the empty seat, the untouched belongings. If this had happened before, then this wasn't just about one missing passenger. This was a pattern, a system, a business. Maria's stomach twisted. She had spent years uncovering corporate corruption. But this was something else entirely. She glanced at the businessman's tablet again. She needed to get her hands on it. If this was a cover-up, there had to be proof, and she was going to find it. Maria felt the weight of the napkin's message settle deep in her chest. Not the first, not the last. If that was true, then this wasn't just about the man in seat 2B. People had disappeared before, and unless she did something, it would happen again. She needed to move carefully. The businessman's tablet was still wedged between the seat and the wall, unnoticed. But Daniel, the flight attendant, hadn't taken his eyes off her since their last exchange. If she reached for it now, it would confirm what they already suspected. She wasn't just another passenger. She had to play this right. Maria took a slow breath, then did something unexpected. She relaxed. She leaned back, crossed her legs, and picked up the in-flight magazine like she had lost interest. A casual observer would think she'd let it go. She felt Daniel watching her. He was waiting for her next move. Good. Let him think she was backing off. She flipped through the magazine, pretending to skim articles, but her mind was working fast. She needed a distraction, something big enough to shift their focus while she grabbed the tablet. Then she spotted it. A woman 3 rows ahead was reaching into her bag, fumbling with a bottle of water. She was slightly older, mid-50s, dressed in a crisp blazer. Her hand was shaking just slightly. Nervous flyer. Maria had seen it before. She made a quick decision. Unbuckling her seatbelt, she stood and took a single step forward before gasping and stumbling slightly, knocking into the woman's arm just enough to send the water bottle toppling onto her lap. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry," Maria said, grabbing a napkin from the drink cart. The woman jumped slightly, flustered, trying to dab at her pants. "It's okay, I should have watched where I was going," Maria continued, keeping her voice warm, apologetic. Immediately, a different flight attendant, an older man this time, rushed over with extra napkins. Daniel turned his head, his attention flicking to the commotion. That was all Maria needed. As they fussed over the woman's spilled water, Maria turned, took 2 silent steps back to the businessman's seat, and palmed the tablet in one quick motion, sliding it into the blanket on her arm. By the time she sat back down, heart pounding, Daniel had looked back at her. But she was already settled, her eyes back on the magazine, flipping a page like nothing had happened. A few minutes later, the commotion died down, and the flight attendants returned to their stations. Maria waited, counted the seconds. Then slowly, she tucked the blanket over her lap and powered on the tablet. It was still locked. But there was a notification on the screen, a preview of an email. Subject: package received, arrival time confirmed. Maria's blood ran cold. Cargo? ETA? This wasn't just a disappearance, it was a transaction. Maria's fingers hovered over the tablet screen. Package received, arrival time confirmed. Her chest tightened. This wasn't a missing person. This was a delivery. She forced herself to breathe, to think. If this was a transaction, then someone on this plane was being moved like cargo. The man in seat 2B, he wasn't just missing, he had been taken. She needed proof. Maria swiped up on the screen, and the tablet prompted a password. Of course, but at the bottom there was an option. Emergency access Face ID required. She felt her stomach drop. She needed his face to unlock it. She clenched her jaw. No time to dwell. She had to work with what she had. She snapped a quick photo of the notification on the screen and tucked the tablet back under the blanket. The risk of getting caught was too high to keep it out in the open. She glanced around. The crew was watching her again. She could feel it. Daniel had shifted closer to her row, pretending to check the overhead bins. Margaret lingered near the galley, pretending not to look in her direction. She knew what came next. They were deciding when to act. Maria exhaled slowly, setting her plan. She didn't need to wait until landing. She needed to force their hand, right now. She reached up and pressed the call button. Margaret appeared seconds later, her smile tight. "Is there something I can help you with, Miss Davis?" Maria tilted her head. "Yes, actually. I was wondering, where's the passenger from seat 2B? Margaret blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness, but she recovered quickly. "I'm afraid I can't discuss other passengers." Maria didn't let her finish. "That's interesting," she said smoothly, "because I overheard you discussing me earlier. Something about how I notice too much." The smile disappeared. Margaret's fingers twitched at her sides. "Miss Davis, Maria leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "I know he didn't just move seats. And I know I'm not imagining things. Now the real question is, how loud do you want me to be about it?" Margaret's expression flickered with something, uncertainty. They weren't expecting this. Maria glanced toward the galley, where the cockpit door remained closed. "See? I have an issue. The Wi-Fi suddenly isn't working. My texts aren't going through. But what do you think happens when we land? When my phone reconnects? When I forward everything I've documented to my colleagues, to the press, to authorities?" Margaret's face paled. "I bet it gets real inconvenient for you," Maria added. Silence stretched between them. Then Margaret inhaled sharply and turned on her heel, disappearing toward the front of the cabin. Maria's pulse pounded. She knew what she had just done. She had forced them to make a decision. They could either ignore her and face questions later, or they could find a way to delay the flight. For the first time since stepping onto this plane, Maria felt like she was ahead of them. A full minute passed, then two. Then, the cabin lights flickered. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to an unforeseen mechanical issue, we will be making an emergency landing at a nearby airport." Maria felt her stomach tighten. There was no mechanical issue. They were grounding the plane because of her. She didn't move, didn't react. But inside, adrenaline surged through her veins. She had forced their next move. Now all she had to do was be ready for it.